Sometimes in the face of authoritarian threats, we in the West have a strange habit of trying to identify authoritarian regimes as right or left. One dictatorship is deemed rightist and another is deemed leftist, even if the regimes in question are doing essentially the same things for essentially the same reasons. Efforts to code authoritarian or totalitarian dictatorships either as representing the left or the right in terms of Western democratic political understanding of these terms misses the more essential point that these ideologies share the essential points in common and always stand far apart from the democratic values embraced by the West. The coding of foreign dictatorial regimes as left or right generally reflects their own attempts at self-justification. Regimes that more frequently invoke the iconography of religion and tradition tend to be coded as right. Regimes that more frequently speak in terms of workers or equality tend to be coded as left. But it's not entirely arbitrary how this coding emerges. But this coding still obscures the fact that these regimes do the same things to their people, work together on common anti-Western projects, and change the nature of their self-justification when it is convenient. The communist regime in Beijing is notionally a left-coded regime because it calls itself communist, and it is increasingly reintroducing education and discussion about Marxism. But it also increasingly uses Confucian language and icons to justify its rule and promotes a kind of ethno-nationalism alongside Marxism. The CCP acts through party committees at big corporations, and all of these characteristics underline the problem of identifying it or trying to label it as being of the left or of the right. Now consider another example. The regime in Russia is frequently seen as right, and the regime in Cuba is frequently seen as left. Canadian liberals who rightly oppose the regime in Moscow preserve a soft spot for the regime in Havana. Our own Prime Minister shamefully described Castro as a, quote, larger-than-life leader who served his people, end quote. Right. But not only do the Russian and Cuban regimes deploy similar methods, they are actively collaborating in the invasion of Ukraine. As mentioned, there are Cuban soldiers directly involved in the invasion of Ukraine. Calling one extreme left and the other extreme right just does not make much sense, given their common approach and their collaboration. These are merely choices of the regime to justify themselves in the terms they find most convenient. Mr. Speaker, my position, our position on this side of the House, is that we should always and everywhere condemn these extreme statist totalitarian regimes, whether they wear the clothes of the right or the clothes of the left, or whether they wear a little bit of each or change their clothes from time to time. On this side of the House, we stand for freedom and democracy, always and everywhere. And we stand against authoritarian and totalitarian dictatorship, regardless of how they code their politics. We are uniquely consistent in this point. And to my friends in other democracies, it's important to underline that the Putin regime is an authoritarian dictatorship, strongly opposed to our values and our interests, and working closely with the regimes in Havana and in Tehran and backed up by the CCP. We cannot fight half the Cold War. There is no sense in opposing our strategic foes in one theater while ignoring their advances in another. These are not different fights. These are different parts of the same fight. And we must look squarely on that challenge and face it to preserve the future that we want for our children and grandchildren. This is why Canadian Conservatives will always stand for freedom. We will stand for freedom here at home, and we will stand for freedom abroad. We will stand for freedom in Afghanistan. We will stand for freedom in Ukraine. We stand for freedom always and everywhere.